If you are struggling in a bad marriage with a spouse, with someone who isn't that very nice to you, today's Bible study is going to be just for you. We're going to meet a woman by the name of Abigail today, and she's going to show us how she handled being married to someone who was actually kind of a jerk. So join us today for our lesson, Being Unhappily Married. We're in the middle of a series right now called Been There and Done That, and we're studying different characters in the Bible who we're hoping to learn something from, people who have been in the situations that we are or done the things that we've done. And so we're trying to learn from them on how to either do what they did or to avoid the mistakes that they made. So today I want to talk about marriage. I don't like to talk about marriage that much. It's really a hard subject for me. It's just kind of not my thing. There are good marriage counselors and pastors and teachers, but I'm probably not going to be one of them. But I do want to talk to you about this today because we're going to learn something very, very important from a woman in the Bible named Abigail, because she's kind of been there. She's been married to a jerk. Okay, she's done that. She managed this totally unhappy marriage. And so I want to learn from her today and see what we can glean from her life that maybe we can take into our own marriages. So let's start here. Because of the whole COVID thing, and during the quarantine, we spent a lot of time watching TV, which is kind of ridiculous. But one Sunday we decided, Rob said, okay, let's each one of us pick out our favorite movie and we'll watch it. So of course Rob's was, most of you know, The Greatest Showman. So we watched that for about the 19th time, I think. It still has the same ending, just in case anyone wanted to know. But then my favorite movie of all time is Ever After with Drew Barrymore. And to me, it's like the greatest Cinderella story in the history of all Cinderella movies. Now, because it's a Cinderella story, we know that. It's a happily ever after story. We know the girl gets the hot prince because that's usually what happens. But there was a lot of things that happened before that whole I get the hot prince came to fruition, because it wasn't a happily ever after story or happily ever before story for her. It had all the other elements that all the Cinderella stories have: the evil stepmother, the evil stepsisters, the unfairness of life, the loss of her mom and dad, the people who just didn't like her and didn't get her. And yet in the end, not only does she get the prize, which is the prince, but she was able to see those that hurt her be accountable for what they did to her. So in every story, that's kind of the ending that we want to see. And so it's kind of what we're going to see today with this story about Abigail. We're going to talk about her. We talked about Abigail in our This Is Life series many, many years ago. And I'm going to use the same pictures that I did because every time I think of Abigail, this is what I think that she looks like, okay? Like there's just something about her. She's beautiful, she's smart, she's kind, she's completely filled with wisdom. And when I wrote that, I was thinking about that movie a long time ago, The Help, I think it was called. And they had this one statement in there where the lady was telling the little girl, she told her this, she said, you is kind, and you is smart, and you is important. So people always know that specific statement. So my sister during COVID, she sent this to me because we were all sitting home eating, and of course that's just what we did. And so the lady that played in the movie, this is what my sister sent me. Honey, you is bored, you is not hungry, you is eating too much. And I thought, yep, that would be me, and probably, hopefully, I'm assuming most of you too. But for Abigail, her life was just not easy. It wasn't because she had a wicked stepmother or stepsisters, but it was because she had a horrible husband. His name was Nabal. I have a picture of him up here. This is what I think he looks like. An evil man, kind of rough, drinks way too much, doesn't really care about his beautiful wife, takes her for granted. He only cares about money. He's very, very selfish, narcissistic. No one's ever going to tell me what to do. That's kind of his thinking in life. So let's pick up their story in 1 Samuel 25, verse 1. Samuel died. All of Israel assembled and mourned for him. They buried him at his home in Ramah. Then David moved down into the desert of Maon. A certain man in Maon who had property there at Carmel was very wealthy. He had 1,000 goats and 3,000 sheep, which he was shearing in Carmel. His name was Nabal, and his wife's name was Abigail. She was an intelligent and beautiful woman, but her husband, a Calebite, was surly and mean in all of his dealings. Here's the setting. There's a little town named Carmel. It's sheep shearing time. Nabal is very wealthy, so they're shearing all of his sheep. But because David and his men don't have jobs, David will be king eventually, but he's not at this particular time. What they did is they would go and they'd be kind of like freelance guardians for the shepherds. So they've been guarding Nabal's 3,000 sheep and helping the shepherds make sure no one stole anything from them. And at that particular time when that happened, it was customary to, if someone guarded your sheep, that at sheep shearing time, you're going to compensate them. It's kind of like what we do as far as tipping someone. If they give you a service, you tip the massage therapist, or you tip the waiter, or you tip the whoever. Like, that's just kind of what we did. And it wasn't mandatory, just like it's not with us, but it was kind of the ethical thing to do. So in 1 Samuel 25:4, it says this: So when David heard that Nabal was shearing his sheep, he sent 10 of his young men to Carmel with this message for Nabal. Peace and prosperity to you, your family, and everything you own. I'm told that it's sheep shearing time. While your shepherds stayed among us near Carmel, we never harmed them, and nothing was ever stolen from them. Ask your own men, and they will tell you this is true. So would you be kind to us, since we have come at a time of celebration? Please share any provisions you might have on hand with us and with your friend David. David's young men gave the message to Nabal in David's name, and they waited for a reply. Now imagine what David's 10 men that were there were thinking. They'd been working for this horrible man, Nabal, without even really being hired from him, or hired by him. And so their financial fate was actually in his hands, and they were probably pretty nervous to see what he had to say. And what he has to say isn't very nice. Look at verse 10. Nabal answered David's servants and said, Who is David? Who is the son of Jesse? There are many servants nowadays who are each breaking away from his master. Shall I then take my bread and my water and my meat that I have killed for my shearers and give it to men who I do not know where they belong? So David's young men turned away and came and told him all that was said. And next we see David. This downside of David, his anger, his pride, his no one's going to tell me what to do. No one's going to tell me something horrible like that. David was just off the charts angry. David says to his men, every man gird on his sword, and they did so. And David also girded on his sword, and they went up after David. About 400 men, and 200 men remained in the baggage. So we're talking David and 400 men are now going to go after Nabal. There's not a lot of humility going in David's life. There's none of this I'm just going to sit down and talk to Nabal and explain to him our situation. And I wonder if David's anger came from a place too of maybe there was a little fear. David was responsible for these 600 men and all of their families. And he probably felt okay, I brought you guys into this, we've been doing this, and I'm going to make sure we get paid, and now Nabal's not paying. And so there's probably a lot going on for David in David's mind. But he should have gone to Nabal and humbly explained what was going on. But instead he's you know what? Let's go get him. Let's go kill every person. Because here's what we're going to learn from the story. Anger really never works out. It just doesn't. It's like the golfer. He was having difficulty on the golf course, so he gets really frustrated on the 13th hole. He hits the ball. It goes into the pond, and he's just so angry about it. So he picks up his golf bag. He spins it around like a discus. He heaves the whole thing into the middle of the lake and stormed off the course, all done with golf, because he's so angry about it. But a few minutes later, people saw him return. And in complete embarrassment, he waded into the pond, because it looked like he just kind of came to his senses. But what he did was he fished out his golf bag. He unzipped the pocket, took out his car keys. And then he flung the bag once back into the pond again, because he was just still so angry. And this time he just threw it farther than before. And then he went home. And the whole point to that is anger can make us do really, really stupid things. And that was where David was, just pure anger. But then something happens. Here you go. Abigail. Beautiful, wise Abigail steps onto the scene. Verse 14 says this, meanwhile, one of Nabal's servants went to Abigail and told her, David sent messengers from the wilderness to greet our master, but he screamed insults at them. These men have been very good to us, and we never suffered any harm from them. Nothing was stolen from us the whole time they were with us. In fact, day and night, they were like a wall of protection to us and the sheep. Even the people working for Nabal were like, this is an evil, horrible man. And he just disregarded anything that his men would say, and he just cared so much for himself. And this is a man that beautiful Abigail was married to. Some of you get that. That your husband, if you're a wife, might not be that nice. Might not be that nice to you or that nice to people. Some of you that are watching are men and you're like, my wife's that way. Like, she's not very nice to me either. But this passage of scripture says this to me, that you can be an Abigail in the midst of being in an unhappy marriage. Like, we kind of need to get that. It's all how you look at what it means to follow Jesus. It's all how you look at actually what marriage is about, what God intended for marriage. And it's not how Hallmark or the media or the culture even portrays it. We were actually watching a Hallmark show the other night, and I looked at Rob and I said, I hate this. Like, I hate this because Hallmark makes you feel like, oh, it's all about ooey gooey feelings and chocolate and wine by the fireplace. And it almost comes as if they want you to believe that those feelings should sustain you through anything bad. But I will tell you what, from someone that's been married for 40 years, that isn't even remotely reality, and it's not even what marriage is about. So I looked up a question on marriage to gotquestions.org. And Erwin Lutzer wrote this in response to someone's question. What is the validity of marriage in today's world? Like, why is marriage even valid in the kind of culture that we live in? He said this, marriage is a sucker's bet. If you get married, you will regret it within 5 years. Don't do it. The man you marry won't be the same man you bury because they change over time. He says such gloomy statements abound in a jaded world filled with marriage skeptics, and many young people are dismayed by such naysaying. Some may even shy away from pursuing marriage. But all the above statements are bad advice because marriage is just as valid today as it was in Hebrews 13:4 when it says, give honor to marriage and remain faithful to one another in marriage. He says the above cynical quotations are striking in their inherent selfishness. The advice they encapsulate would have merit only, here you go, if marriage were intended solely to gratify one's personal desires, but that is not the purpose of marriage. See, I was thinking about this. Most people think that when they go into marriage, they just assume that it's all about their own gratification. When I want this, my spouse needs to give it to me. When I want that, my spouse needs to give it to me. And we go into marriage thinking it's all about me. But here's what we need to know. The marriage vow is not a lifetime commitment to be loved or to receive loved. It's like this. When you and I get married, it's not, I didn't marry Rob because I thought he was just going to fulfill all my desires and he was going to always love me. Like, I hope he does, but I'm just saying that's not, it's kind of like when you get into marriage, and no one's telling our kids this, you're vowing to love that person, to be there for them. I was thinking about a girl from high school, friends with my sister. She married her boyfriend out of high school. And I don't know, within maybe 10 years, 15 years, he got Alzheimer's, really young age. Well, what do you do with that? I don't know. She's vowed to stay with him and take care of him and love him to the end. And that's just like, it's like, I don't know. I'm sorry that happened. But when you vow, that's your vow. It's not for him to make her always happy because sometimes it doesn't work out that way. Here you go. Marriage is a vow to give love. It's a promise to give love for life. It's a determination to live for the benefit of the other, to stand by and beside the other or behind the other. And to give and give and give and give and give and give, even life itself. And see, I think that's why we're seeing so many people getting divorced. And we're seeing this in the church even, because we hear things like, well, my spouse isn't meeting my needs. My spouse is not showing me love. My spouse is not acting the way I want them to act. And suddenly we see marriage as, I'm only going to be happy when that person does what I want them to do. And then what happens is when you don't feel happy, you go outside of your marriage because you're like, well, I know that other guy will make me happy. That other guy pays more attention to me. And therefore, people get divorced. And I really think it all comes down to not understanding why we should get married in the first place, because your spouse, I promise you, will never, ever meet your every need. If you think that, then you need to not get married, because marriage is about giving, not taking. Which is why we always say, the people that their marriages work, it usually works when both people love Jesus. And both people are obeying what Jesus says the greatest commandment is, which is love God first. If a husband's loving God first and a wife is loving God first, and the husband's putting the wife first and the wife is putting the husband first, it's just going to work. But marriages break up because husbands refuse to love their wife like Christ loved the church. Rob always says, men have the worst part in marriage because it's our job, Rob says, to make my wife happy. That's just what I have to do. But when that breaks down and a man stops caring for his wife, then what happens is then the wife stops respecting her husband. And then it becomes all about me, and then the marriage blows up. Erwin Lutzer says this, mankind did not invent marriage, God did. It is not in discovering the most beautiful model or the most dashing knight that a good marriage is found. It's in recognizing God's prepared choice of the most suitable life partner, the one most compatible with God's purposes and objectives, that the most truly satisfying marriage is built. Romance surely has its place and will be enjoyed in a godly marriage, but only as the fruit of a much deeper, stronger relationship. Cheyenne was talking to me one day about who she wants to marry and when she what she wants to do when she gets married. She goes, Mom, it's just really all about finding someone who we can just serve God together. And that's kind of a perfect way to put it. Here's what Erwin goes on to say. Yes, the honeymoon will end. Yes, both husband and wife will prove to be somewhat different than what they presented to each other while courting. Yes, sooner or later, both spouses will be disappointed in something about one another. And yet trials will come, testing the strength of their vows. But none of that changes the fact that God had a good idea when he invented marriage. One element that the critics of marriage always miss is faith. Marriage and family are God's institutions for mankind. If a Christian is truly walking with God, truly wanting God's best for his or her spouse, truly wanting to further God's plan for himself, for his spouse, and for the world, then he will not abandon the idea of marriage. It's not about what we can get out of marriage. It is not the takers of this world who find fulfillment, but the givers. Those who by God's grace emulate the self-sacrificial giving of Christ, thus growing in his image. A good marriage will cost everything we have, and in that giving, we will find the highest meaning in the life of Christ. That's all good. But the problem is we don't see a lot of it nowadays. We were talking to a pastor the other night, and he said this. He said, you know what? He said, this generation is so different. He said, I grew up with like this line right here. He said, I grew up thinking like this is the line when I become a follower of Jesus. He said, my goal in life was always to raise the bar, to go higher, to go above the bar, and to do more things instead of less things. He said, but this generation tries to do whatever they can below the line. He said they kind of go, hey, how much sin can I get into before it's too much that'll get me in trouble? How much can I flirt with that guy who isn't my husband, like, before it's going too far? Do you see how that works? It's kind of like this generation is doing everything they can to see how much they can get away with, to where the older generation is like, I just want to serve God and I want to see what I can do above the bar. It's just this difference. Now, I want to talk about this for a second. Are there biblical grounds for a divorce? And the answer to that is yes, just so you know that. And hopefully that will give some of you the freedom you need to, once you understand that. But I think it's in very, very rare situations. Very rare, serious situations like adultery, abuse, abandonment, which, by the way, is maybe about 5% of all Christians. The other 95% need to stay, and they need to make it work. Like I said, these 5% are very serious things that you work through biblically to figure out what God says to do in it. Because the problem is this, what we're hearing is, well, he doesn't act like he loves me, I should divorce him. And he doesn't pay that much attention to me, he won't go to church with me, he drinks beer in the house, he plays too much golf. Those are not biblical grounds for a divorce, just so you know that. So what are biblical grounds? My husband isn't a believer and he mocks my faith. Like, is that a biblical grounds? My husband's an alcoholic, a workaholic, he smokes pot in the house all the time. Like, is that grounds for divorce? Maybe your husband gambles his, all your, food money away. Is that grounds for divorce? Maybe your spouse lies to you. Is that grounds for divorce? Luckily for you, I'm not going to answer that question. Here's why. Because Mike Winger, I'm going to send you right over to his website. He just did 3 hours. He spent 200 hours researching biblical divorces and what the Bible says about it, all the way from the beginning to the end. And it's really, really good. And so what he does is he deals with all of those questions. But he said this. He said the saddest part is that if someone wants a divorce, they're going to find a way to rationalize it. They're going to find a way to get out. If your husband rolls over at night and he's sleeping and accidentally hits your arm, you're going to wake up in the next morning and say, my husband abuses me. And that's not true. But he said, here's the problem. People are missing what marriage is about. And in this culture, people are spending more time trying to find ways to get out of their marriage than work to find ways to stay in. But we learn a very valuable lesson from sweet little Abigail and her mean, awful husband. And here's what we don't see from her. We don't hear this, my husband's a jerk, so I'm going to leave him. My husband drank too much and got drunk last night, and I'm going to leave him. My husband's a jerk to me. Like, you don't see that from her. What we see is that she stayed. And what we see from her is that she was this light, this bright light to her husband and to all the people that were around her awful husband. Here's what they knew. They knew that she knew and trusted that God could take care of Nabal for her. She just knew that. And somehow she just exuded that to all these people that were around her. And what she tells us is that we can be a light in the midst of a not that great marriage. And we see that with Abigail. Imagine this, the guys who worked for her cuckoo crazy husband, they came to her. Hey, your husband's doing this. Hey, what do you think we should do? And they did that because she responded in wisdom and love and kindness. She never left her husband. She just lived her life with the light of God all around her. Verse 17 says this, so know this and consider what you will do. For evil is determined against our master and all his house, for he is such a wicked man that one cannot speak to him. The people who work for her came to her and said, look, David's coming. And it's not going to be good because your husband was such a jerk to them that they're going to come kill him. But they told Abigail that. And that always amazes me. It's like they really honestly trusted that she knew the right answer for this. Now, for a lot of people, if you're an Abigail, you're going to be thinking this, here's my chance to get rid of him. Like, here's my chance to get rid of this, like, this man who's awful to me, and I'm in this arranged marriage, and I don't love him, and this is an opportunity of a lifetime. This made me laugh. Steve Jones said this. He said his wife, Tammy, took a liking to this TV show called Snapped. So one of the episodes was, the episodes always focused on a woman who seemed to live in a normal life, but then one day she snaps and she kills her husband. The other night, it was about there was a show, on that show, it was about a preacher's wife. And she just snapped. And she killed her husband, who was a preacher. So Steve looks over at his wife, Tam, and he sees that she's kind of tearing up, and she's got tears in her eyes. And he said, you know what, honey, I know why you're so troubled. And I agree. He said, 5 years for killing her preacher husband just isn't enough time. And Tammy goes, well, it's not that. I was just thinking that if I'd snapped back in 2003, I'd be out by now. I thought that was cute. But look what Abigail does. She doesn't say, hey guys, let's all hide. Let's just leave Nabal in the barn and let's go hide and let David do what he needs to do. And this way we can get rid of my horrible husband. She doesn't be like, I'm going to just run to David first and tell him how bad my husband is and what I really want to do is get out of my marriage and can he help me? She doesn't do any of those things. She humbly does what she can to save her husband and their servants. Isn't that amazing? Glenda Lomax wrote this, that one night she went to a Denny's in April. She stopped by and she went to go get some food or something, and her waiter was this tall man with a South African accent. She said she watched him just like hurrying and smiling and helping all of the customers. She said it was really weird. There was this refined quality about him. So she asked him, what did you do before you did this? And he said, well, in my country, I ran several large companies. And so she knew he was had this executive management position. And then he moved here and she couldn't understand why he would do this menial task of being a waiter or whatever, serving people. So she asked him about it and he said, the reason why I do what I do is because I now have the privilege of serving others. And she said he laid the check down and walked away to help other people, but she thought the privilege of serving others, we don't see that in our culture today. And that just reminded me of Abigail. As long as she was married to Nabal, she would do what she could to serve him and her household. And she considered this a privilege. We don't get that nowadays. She was living, here you go, she was living above the bar. She wasn't trying to see how much she could get away with down here. She was living above the bar. She wasn't trying to find ways to leave him. She was going to do what she could in the place that she was, and she would leave the rest to God. So look what she does. Verse 18, Abigail lost no time. She took 200 loaves of bread, 2 skins of wine, 5 dressed sheep, 5 seahs of roasted grain, 100 cakes of raisins, and 200 cakes of pressed figs, and loaded them on donkeys. Then she told her servants, go on ahead, I'll follow you. But she did not tell her husband Nabal. That is wisdom. It's knowing what to say when. Because she could have marched out to the barn and started yelling at him and be like, how could you do this to us? You're such a jerk. She could have done that. But she didn't. And that's why for us, studying Proverbs is kind of really important. Proverbs 20 verse 3 says, avoiding a fight is a mark of honor. Only fools insist on quarreling. Proverbs 10:12 says this, hatred stirs up strife, but love covers all sins. Proverbs 17:14, the beginning of strife is like letting out water, so quit before the quarrel breaks out. Proverbs wasn't even written at that particular time, but it seems like God had given Abigail the same kind of wisdom. So verse 20, she comes riding her donkey into a mountain ravine, and there were David and his men descending towards her, and she met them. David had just said, it's been useless all my watching over this fellow's property in the desert so that nothing of his was missing. He paid me back evil for good. May God deal with David, be it ever so severely, if by morning I leave alive one male of all who belong to him. Here is our David, sweet man after God's own heart. He was so angry, he's going to go and kill everyone associated with Nabal. But then verse 23, when Abigail saw David, she quickly got off her donkey, bowed down before David. With her face to the ground, she fell at his feet and said, my lord, let the blame be on me alone. Please let your servant speak to you. Hear what your servant has to say. Can you imagine? She falls at his feet and takes complete blame for her idiot husband. And she's there because she's there to save all the people who work for her and her husband. And she basically is sacrificing herself. This is an awesome woman. Someone who cares deeply for the people around her more than she does herself. And she doesn't even mind groveling to help them. Chuck Swindoll says this, I'm impressed with her integrity. She chose to protect her husband and family, not because he deserved it, not because he was good, but because she was good. Despite how bad a husband he had been, she chose to remain honorable in her role as his partner, even when he was not present. That just amazes me. Verse 25 says this, I know Nabal is a wicked and ill-tempered man. She's telling this to David. Please don't pay any attention to him. He is a fool, just as his name suggests. But I never even saw the young men you sent. In other words, I'm so sorry, David. I had no idea this was going on. She reiterates, my husband is just not that nice of a man. But if I can stand in the gap, then please let me do that. Verse 26, she goes on, now since the Lord has kept you, my master, this is what she's saying to David, from bloodshed and from avenging yourself with your own hands, as surely as the Lord lives and as you live, may your enemies and all who intend to harm my master be like Nabal. And let this gift, she has all this food, which your servant has brought to my master, be given to the men who follow you. When we say she knows how to win a man's heart by lots and lots of food, apparently, at this point, I think David is in complete awe of this woman. This is how I picture David. Like he's just looking at her with his mouth open going, I don't even know what to say to you because you're kind of beautiful and you're kind of awesome and you're kind of wise. And I don't even think he knows what to say. Someone wrote this, the most courageous people in the world are the ones who never pick up a weapon or those who choose to lay their weapons down. Verse 28 says this, please forgive me if I've offended you in any way, she goes on to tell David. The Lord will surely reward you with a lasting dynasty, for you are fighting the Lord's battles, and you have not done wrong throughout your entire life. In other words, she's saying, David, you have a calling on your life. God is with you. David, you are an honorable man. If you do this, it's going to completely ruin your reputation. She's literally counseling David, the next in line to be king. Verse 29, she goes on to say, even when you are chased by those who seek to kill you, your life is safe in the care of the Lord your God, secure in his treasure pouch, but the lives of your enemies will disappear like stones shot from a sling. Abigail must know all about David. I always say she must have been reading like People magazine, all the articles about David. She must have known he'd been on the run from Saul and how God always protected him. She must have remembered, David and Goliath because if she mentioned this about the slingshot. Abigail must love God and have a really great relationship with him because the words pouring out of her mouth were promoting David to be the next king and to not do anything stupid. Abigail is reminding David, God will fight your battles for you. Abigail is saying, David, my husband Nabal is a nobody. Leave him to God. God is going to take care of Nabal for you. Don't mess up your life because of him. Verse 30, when the Lord has done all he promised and has made you leader of Israel, this is what she's telling David, don't let this be a blemish on your record. Then your conscience won't have to bear the staggering burden of needless bloodshed and vengeance. And when the Lord has done these great things for you, please remember me, your servant. She knew she was talking to the next king of Israel, and she's saying, David, you don't want blood on your hands. You don't want that. You don't want your men seeing you slaughter innocent people just because you're angry or your pride is hurt. She's saying, David, you need to let it go. You need to let God take his vengeance on Nabal in his own way and his own timing. And I think Abigail's words should probably speak to some of you listening today. Let it go. Whoever has hurt you, whoever has hurt your pride, whoever has hurt your reputation, you need to let it go. Because when you take matters into your own hands, that never turns out. And it always hurts you more than it hurts them. Romans 12:18 and 19 says this, if it's possible, as much as it depends on you, live peaceably with all men. Beloved, do not avenge yourselves, but rather give place to wrath, for it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. In other words, let God do what God needs to do. And then David speaks finally, or I think he gushes at this particular point. David replied to Abigail, praise the Lord, the God of Israel, who sent you to meet me today. Thank God for your good sense. Bless you for keeping me from murder and from carrying out vengeance with my own hands. For I swear by the Lord, the God of Israel, who kept me from hurting you, that if you had not hurried out to meet me, not one of Nabal's men would still be alive tomorrow morning. Then David accepted her present and told her, return home in peace. I have heard what you said. We will not kill your husband. I don't know why. That's just this greatest scene ever. Here is a woman with a horrible husband living this marriage that is so unhappy, and yet she stands in the gap for her husband. She's pointing people to God. She's reminding people that God is in control, and she reminds people to let God handle the difficult people in our life. I always imagine, what if everyone who says they're a follower of Jesus could do that? Who takes those that hurt us or left us or gossip about us or stole from us, that instead of revenge, we acted like Abigail and we prayed for them and we had their back and we refused to talk about them behind their back. Imagine what that would do to promote Jesus in this world. Because the people that would watch you do that, they'd be like, why aren't you angry with them? Why don't you hate your husband? Why are you doing what you're doing? And we can say, you know what? Because they are God's deal. And I will trust him to do only what he can. But in the meantime, I'm going to live in peace. Because I have given that person over to God so he can deal with them. I don't need to worry about it anymore. And I think how Abigail handles this is a great lesson for all of us. So verse 36, Abigail arrived home. She found that Nabal was throwing a big party. He was celebrating like a king, and he was very drunk. So she didn't tell him anything about her meeting with David until dawn the next day. This always made me laugh. Speaking of drinking, there was a juggler. He's driving to his next performance. He stopped by the police, and in the back he had these machete knives. And the police officer said, what are you doing with all those knives? And he said, well, I juggle them in my act. And so the cop didn't really believe him. So he says, let me see you do it. So the juggler gets out and he starts, catching and throwing them up in the air and all that, all these knives. Another man was driving by slow and he said, wow. He said, I'm glad I quit drinking. Look at the test they're giving now. But here's something that we need to know. As women, or if you're a man and you have a spouse, this could be interchangeable here with your husband to your wife or wife to your husband. We need to kind of shut our mouths until we know the timing's right. And the reason why I say this, I get that because I know there's a lot of times that I really need to talk to Rob about something. And maybe it's like a bill that just came in or something that happened at work that I'm kind of nervous about or something. But I know this is that the end of the day is really hard for Rob. He's really tired. And I know if I spring something on him at the end of the day, it just totally stresses him out. And so I have a choice in life to either care more about me, like I just need to talk to him because I need to feel better about this, or to care more for him. And a lot of times I do pop out and say things, that I shouldn't ask him about when he's tired. And it never turns out very good because he can't focus, and then it gets overwhelming to him, and then he can't sleep because then he starts, stressing over it. And so what I've learned is what Abigail learns, like, you know what? Let's wait for the right time. And since Rob's a morning person, I pray about something and then I go talk to him. It's like this, when COVID hit, of course our Bible study's been shut down. And Rio, where we're having the Bible study, we couldn't come back, and we thought it would be a 2-week thing and then went to a month and then 2 months and 3 months, and we're still in the midst of it. And so at the time we were like, Rob's like, I don't even know if we're ever going to go back to Rio. I don't know if, we set up tables, women are sitting around, there's food, I don't know if anyone's ever going to want to come back again. And so Rob said, why don't we just stop doing live Bible studies and just set up a studio at our house, and we'll put the cameras there and we'll do all that, and that'll just be what we do, because all of our stuff goes online and that's where most people watch us anyway. So he was all excited about this, and he was, figuring out how to do it. So one day I was blow drying my hair, and the studio thing just was not feeling right to me. Mostly because the time it got built, we'd probably be back to Rio. So I prayed about it because I didn't want to hurt his feelings, and I didn't want to dash his excitement for the whole thing. So I sat down in the morning when I knew he could, focus, and I said, let's talk about the studio. And so I just started telling him all my thoughts about it. And then by the time I got done talking, he said, I'm actually relieved that you said that. But it's all this idea of, you don't just throw things out at your husband or your spouse or whatever if you don't know that if they know they can't handle it at that time. If your husband's overwhelmed with something or your wife's overwhelmed, just zip it until you know the timing is right. And I think that's the one thing Abigail teaches us. Timing is everything. Now, I have a really nice husband, but I need to be sensitive to his day. But for Abigail, she has a not so nice husband. And so she does the same thing. She's like, I'm going to wait until my husband's not drunk and he's sober and tell him what happened with David the day before. So I bet that night she went to bed knowing her husband was drunk. She was praying for the right words to say the next morning, praying that God would go before her and pave the way to tell him what happened with the soon-to-be king. Here's what we learned. Wisdom is watching our words and waiting for the right time. So verse 37 says, in the morning when Nabal was sober, his wife told him what happened. As a result, he had a stroke, and he lay paralyzed on his bed like a stone. And about 10 days later, the Lord struck him, and he died. Here's the point, is that God can get rid of evil people whenever he wants. And Abigail always did what she knew was right in the sight of God, and she trusted God would sustain her through it all, through this horrible marriage. And this was how God blessed Abigail. Her husband died. Okay? And I assume that that's not how God gets rid of awful spouses. Just because you have an awful spouse doesn't mean God's going to kill them off. But it's just a reminder that God is really that big and he can handle our enemies for us. And then here's my all-time favorite part of the story. Verse 39, when David heard that Nabal was dead, he said, praise the Lord who has avenged the insult I received from Nabal and kept me from doing it myself. Nabal has received the punishment for his sin. Then David sent messengers to Abigail to ask her to become his wife. When the messengers arrived at Carmel, they told Abigail, David has sent us to take you back to marry him. Seriously, is that the best Cinderella story ever? See, before there was a Cinderella and a prince and an evil stepmother, there was a soon-to-be King David and Abigail and evil Nabal. Look how God blessed Abigail for her humility and her wisdom and her trust in God to handle things for her. Look at what God did. It's so amazing. Her path crossed with David at the right time. Nabal was being horrible Nabal at the right time. God used Abigail to save David from destroying himself at the right time. And God just heaped blessing upon beautiful Abigail. Imagine the servants knocking at her door and saying, David's calling you and wants you to be his wife. Verse 41, she arose and bowed herself to the earth and said, behold, let your handmaid be a servant to wash the feet of the servants of my Lord. Here, the servants show up and she's still serving. She's like, oh, can I wash your feet? This woman's amazing. Verse 42, and Abigail hastened and arose and rode on a donkey with 5 of her maids who followed her, and she went after the messengers of David and became his wife. So here is the takeaway today. Some of you are in really, really tough marriages like Abigail. Everyone is telling you should leave. Hey, life is short. Hey, why do you want to stay married to that guy? He's kind of a jerk. Hey, someone else out there is probably going to be nicer to you. And honestly, all those things are possibly really true. But from Abigail, we see something we don't see much of today, and that's his loyalty to her vows. Remember, this was most likely an arranged marriage, but she still took it really, really serious. And as much as Abigail tried to change her husband, it never happened. Some of you are trying desperately to change your husband, and it's not happening. But for those of you who are married to Nabals, if you are a follower of Jesus and your husband is not even a Christian, look at what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 7:13. If a believing woman has a husband who is not a believer and he is willing to continue living with her, she must not leave him. Why? This exact story. Don't you realize, wives, that your husbands might get saved because of you? And don't you husbands realize that your wives might be saved because of you? A lot of you are like, I seriously hate that verse. But what strikes me is this, a couple things as we end. Abigail had a great relationship with God. That was first and foremost in her life. The second thing is this, she focused on serving God regardless of her husband. See, you and I can still serve God and love God, and we don't even have to be married to Christian guys. We really don't. We can still love God amidst all of that. Here was a man who wasn't even loving or compassionate. He never met her halfway. He only cared about herself, but she was not going to leave until God released her. For those of you that have non-believing spouses, remember that God is big enough to release you, just like he did with Abigail, if that's what needs to happen. But there are so many people, and I want you to know this, that maybe committed adultery. And the person who committed adultery was very repentant. And the spouse was very forgiving. And they have beautiful marriages today. And a lot of people look back and they're thankful that they didn't walk out of their marriage at year 5 because at year 20, their husband got saved and they have this great, awesome marriage. A lot of people look back and they're thankful they didn't listen to their friends or their family because they really trusted that God would give them the ability to love their unlovable spouse. And then God saved them. See, God doesn't always kill them off. God saves them a lot of times. So the question is this: does your husband see Jesus in you? And I think that's the question, because everyone saw Abigail and saw how she treated and loved her husband regardless. How do you respond to your husband if he's a jerk? Like, do you respond like Abigail? Look at Proverbs 31:10. An excellent wife, who can find her? For her worth is far above jewels. The heart of her husband trusts in her, and he will have no lack of gain. She does him good and not evil all the days of her life. See, Abigail did good and not evil to her husband, and he was not even nice. And yet she lived her life for God regardless of how her husband treated her. And that should be reassuring to those of you who have husbands like Nabal. The key is this: the key is to take serious your commitment and to stay focused on being a follower of Jesus. But I want to throw this out. Never, ever, ever stay if you are being abused. And I really want to say that because a lot of you have been told, like, oh, you should stay in an abusive relationship. No, you shouldn't. Jesus would never, ever. And Mike Winger on his website, you need to go to, you can just type in Mike Winger marriage on YouTube, and you'll see this 200 hours of research to explain it. And he will give you biblical reasons why Jesus says you need to remove yourself from that situation. But I want to just throw out a warning, and I want you to start thinking about setting your sights above the bar as a follower of Christ. Because a lot of times we set our sights below the bar. And so what we do is we can even take that word abuse and misconstrue it. People will say, well, my husband yelled at me. That's abuse. My husband came home late. That's abuse. See, remember the bar? We need to go above the bar and not try to get away with things down here. And we do that by just being selfless in our marriage like Abigail. See, as a follower of Jesus, our greatest desire should be to want to do God's will. And we need to be able to say, God, whatever you want me to do, I'm going to do it. And if I'm supposed to stay in this marriage, I'm not talking abusive marriage, I'm just talking a husband that maybe you think doesn't love you or doesn't act nice to you. God, I just want to do what you want me to do. I want to ignore the people who tell me that I should walk out of my marriage. I want us to be people different. Because right now, people look for reasons to leave instead of looking for reasons to stay. And if you have a biblical grounds for divorce, then you need to pray and see what God would have in store for you. Because like we said, God can restore anything. We have seen him restore more marriages that you'd be like, they were doomed. There's a couple marriages we know right now that are just on their way to divorce court. And I always pray, God, I know you can restore this. I know you can restore it. If you need encouragement to hang in there, go to this website, rejoiceministries.org. And on there they have testimony after testimony of Abigails who are married to Nabals and God saving the marriage. This made me laugh because marriage is difficult, and a lot of times women don't think their husbands know much about them. So while attending a marriage seminar dealing with communication, Tom and his wife, Grace, listened to the instructor. The instructor said it's essential that husbands and wives know each other's likes and dislikes. So he asked Tom, he said, can you name your wife's favorite flower? He's thinking rose, carnation, whatever. He leans over and touched his wife's arm gently and whispered, I think it's Pillsbury, isn't it? I'm like, wrong kind of flower, okay? Here's a really cool quote from Zig Ziglar. He says this: I have no way of knowing whether or not you married the wrong person, but I do know that many people have a lot of wrong ideas about marriage and what it takes to make that marriage happy and successful. I'll be the first to admit that it's possible that you did marry the wrong person. However, if you treat the wrong person like the right person, you could well end up having married the right person after all. On the other hand, if you marry the right person and treat that person like the wrong person, you certainly will have ended up marrying the wrong person. I also know that it's far more important to be the right kind of person than it is to marry the right person. In short, whether you're married to the right or wrong person, it's primarily up to you. So the takeaway for today is this. Abigail has been there in a bad marriage, and she's done that where she left everything, the revenge, up to God. And God blessed her for it. And I think that's a great lesson for us. I believe this. She had a great relationship with God. She knew God was very powerful. She knew God was intimately involved in her life. God was very personal to her. And I think that's the lesson. We need to aspire to that. I think we can learn that from this woman, this amazing woman who has been there and done that. Father, for those of us, those of people out there that are struggling in their marriages, God, I pray that Abigail will give them hope. I pray that you would be with these struggling marriages. Help us as Christian women to be able to love our husbands the way you want us to love them, to be a light to those around him and to around other people. And God, for those that need to get out of a very abusive marriage, I pray that you will give them the ability to do that and the strength to be able to do that also. But more than anything, God, I pray that you would help us to do everything we can to stay in a marriage instead of trying to find ways to get out of it. And I pray for that. Thank you for the life of Abigail and what she teaches us. In Jesus' name, amen.